In many scriptures in the Bible, we're told by the prophets to cry aloud, spare not, tell God's people their sins. Then in other scriptures, Israel, and physical nations were warned of imminent disaster. They've been told over and over in various scriptures by the prophets that when warfare will come upon a land, then God would reveal it to his prophets first and allow them to understand so that a warning could take place. This is mentioned in Amos 3, verse 7, that God would not do anything unless he revealed it to his servants, the prophets, first. Also in Ezekiel chapter 33, I'll start in verse 2. It says, Son of man, speak to the children of your people and say unto them, when I bring the sword or warfare upon a land, if the people of the land take a man of their coast and set him for their watchman, if when he sees the sword come upon the land, he blows the trumpet, and the trumpet is a warning device. That's one of the uses for a trumpet, to tell people that imminent war and danger is upon them. And warn the people, then whosoever hears the sound of the trumpet and takes not warning, if the sword come and take him away, his blood shall be upon his own head. So God does instruct his ministry. In this particular case, it was Ezekiel, but Ezekiel wrote it down. The house of Israel was taken into captivity from 721 to 718 B.C. This was written 130 years later after that happened, so this only could be for the time at the end of the age in which we live today. Verse 5. He heard the sound of the trumpet and took not warning. His blood shall be upon him. But he that takes warning shall deliver his soul. Brethren, that is our job today. We must give warning to a dying culture, a dying civilization that's turned its back in whole upon God. While many people, and 85% of this country, still claims to be Christian, and they still believe in God, there's a very few in comparison to the population that live as if they really believe it. So we must give warning, and for those few here and there and scattered individuals who will take that warning, they can deliver their soul just like you and I. Verse 6, But if the watchmen see the sword come, and blow not the trumpet, and the people be not warned, if the sword come and take any person from among them, he is taken away in his iniquity. But his blood will I require at the watchman's hand. That is our responsibility. We see these things coming. We see Bible prophecy happening. The blood of many people, if we don't take that message out, is going to be required at our collective hands. Not just mine as an individual. Because you see, even when Moses, it was Moses or Joshua. Remember the long day when God said, Joshua asked that God would work a miracle so that they could go ahead and defeat their enemy, because if the sun set and went down, they were winning the battle, and they may not win the battle because the enemies may regroup. And others of Israel held up the hands of Joshua so that as long as his hands were up, they would win the victory. So other individuals were also right there in the midst, holding the hands up. It wasn't just Joshua, it was a collective effort. And then the individual Israelites were out fighting the war. And so it was a joint effort of everybody, not just one individual. Verse 7, So you, O Son of man, I've set you a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore you shall hear the word at my mouth, and warn them from me. This is our collective job, to warn Israel of something that's imminent. That we have turned our back upon the living Jesus Christ, our God. We have turned our back upon God the Father. We have gone after worldly pursuits. And as a direct result, judgment is now coming upon this nation. And only those who will hear the warning and turn will be saved. Verse 8, When I say unto the wicked, O wicked man, you shall surely die, if you do not speak to warn the wicked from his way, that wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at your hand. Nevertheless, if you warn the wicked of his way to turn from it, repentance. If he do not turn from his way, he shall die in his iniquity, but you have delivered your soul. This is us, brethren. If we are willing to collectively be behind the ministry that God is raising up to warn this nation to repent, then we will have deliverance. And I believe that with all of my heart. I don't believe God is going to write something down and then send people into the midst of all this activity that's going to take place and then break His word to us. I believe He's going to save us. Some physically from the things that are about to take place when this country is overthrown. Now, why did I read this to start with? Because obviously it's going to be a prophetic message today. Because we have to warn the people in this country. Now, in Revelation chapter 6, there is a horse that's turned loose upon mankind. And it's a great horse. The first seal is a white horse. And here is individuals going out conquering religiously to prepare the world for a one-world religion. And they're infiltrating every religious organization on earth. And they're converting them into a New Age movement for the very purpose of a one-world government and one-world religion. Then in verse 3 and 4, and when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, Come and see. And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword, a great military arsenal to take peace from the earth. And notice what it said. It's going to do two things. Number one, take peace from the earth, but also it's going to kill people. It's going to be used to reduce the population of the earth, and also it's going to be used in order to so cause suffering upon the human race that all people would collectively cry out and say, we need an instrument to solve the problems and bring about world government and world peace at last. Now in 1871, Albert Pike received a letter from Giuseppe Mazzini. Giuseppe Mazzini, an Italian revolutionary of the Illuminati, was the one who formulated the last 100-year program for world government. He said they would have to have at least 2 world wars and many brush fire wars, revolutionary wars all over the world. And then, if necessary, there would be a 3rd world war that would be of such gigantic proportions that finally all people on earth would throw up their hands and say, in order to be saved from total annihilation, we must have world government. Have we seen these things happening? There was World War I in 1917 or 1914 to 1918. There was World War II in 1939, really, to 45. We've seen Cambodia overthrown, Vietnam, North Korea. We've seen Laos. We've seen the Philippines now overthrown. We've seen Cuba. We've seen Angola. 1/3 to half of all the land mass in Africa is now communist, and they're now working feverishly upon South Africa, Union of South Africa. We've seen the Middle Central Europe, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Estonia, all the rest, Poland, East Germany, right down the line. When you take a look at the world with a map, you can see that the Soviet Union has gobbled up nearly 60% of the landmass, or 40% of the landmass, and 60% of the population of the earth. So these things are happening. There is a tremendous red horse that is gobbling up the earth. V.I. Lenin said they would first take Central America, or Central Europe. Then they would take the masses of Asia. While this was taking place, they would surround the United States, and they would so infiltrate it that it would fall like an overripe grapefruit. So what I want to do now is kind of look back and summarize and see some of the problems that are taking place. And ask ourselves, has the United States been sold out from within? Have we? I want to read a letter from a former member of the Armed Forces, General Jack Moore. This is what he wrote to a House of Representatives member, Trent Lott, dated September 22nd, 1986. Greetings from the Gulf Coast. You'll possibly remember me from former conversation and correspondence regarding the Mexican border situation. For over 5 years now, I've been doing in-depth research on the situation in Mexico regarding the Soviet Union and have consolidated my findings with those of Earl Jones of Deming, New Mexico, a retired missile expert from White Sands Proving Ground. Now, these are two high-up officers, former military officers. I'll continue the letter. We've pooled the information we've received from hundreds of on-the-ground observers on both sides of the border. In May of this year, Sheriff Gary Painter, Sheriff of Midland County, Midland, Texas, heard of our work and sent Spanish-speaking deputies into Mexico to check out our observations. They not only came back with evidence that corroborated our observations, but brought back evidence of 12 terrorist training camps in southern Mexico, being funded with Colombian drug money and evidently being given some protection at least by the Mexican government. And I'll amen that. I believe it is given protection from the Mexican government because Mexico has been little by little turned into a socialist country since the 1930s. And then we were thrown off XERF radio in Mexico when they took over all communication media. And that means they are now solidifying their hold upon the people as a communist regime. I'll continue the letter. On June 10th, 11th, and 12th, 1986, Sheriff Painter flew to Washington, D.C. at his own expense and presented his observations to a representative of Vice President Bush, the CIA, the FBI, and the State Department. He came home a disillusioned man from the treatment he had received. He was literally threatened by the State Department to keep quiet about what he had learned. When he went on a radio talk show in San Antonio, Texas, a few days later to tell his story, the FBI immediately got into the act and began to investigate into Sheriff Painter and his deputies. Now think what's happening here. Here are loyal Americans who are trying to warn the people of this country of imminent danger and an overrun of communism in the southwestern part of the United States. A law officer and his deputies. And as a direct result of him squealing on what's taking place, now they are under investigation by the FBI, instead of the FBI going after and proving that what he was reporting was true. He was told that his men were in the pay of Lyndon LaRouche and had gone into Mexico with the purpose of assassinating a high-ranking Soviet official, and thus to torpedo the summit meetings. This summit meeting was between Reagan and Gorbachev. Sheriff Painter emphatically denies this. Two deputies have also been approached by what is obviously a sting operation by the FBI, as they've been offered a large sum of money to smuggle guns into Mexico. This is serious business. They're trying to frame the very people that are trying to warn America. The sheriff believes this is an attempt to blackmail him and his men into silence. On September 15th, and at the time that he wrote this letter, it was a week had gone by, I received word from Earl Jones that two men from the National Security Council wanted to meet with Jones, Sheriff Painter, and myself in Midland, Texas. 2 hours later, I flew to Midland at my own expense to meet these men. They never showed up, but telephoned the next day to say that they could not come because of heavy pressure from upstairs to drop the subject. Heavy pressure from the State Department to drop the subject of an investigation into 12 terrorist training camps in Mexico. Mr. Jones, Sheriff Painter, and myself and two deputies met in Midland, Texas on September 23 for an all-day session, where we were given a thorough orientation about their findings and exchanged information with them. Now he's going to talk very personal to this congressman. He says, Trent, this is the point of the whole mess. What has happened in our government? That when honest, patriotic citizens find information which should be made available to our people, they are immediately silenced by higher authority. What has happened? Have we been sold out? Is America now going down the drain? And are we at the twilight hours of our freedom in this country? Please do not deny this, he went on to say, since I've had it happen to me personally. Another example was the affair a few weeks ago with the CMA. These are individuals who have gotten together to guard our border. They're not official policemen. When they made citizens' arrest of illegal aliens along the border, instead of receiving thanks, they were treated as criminals for stopping illegal aliens from coming into this country. Millions of our people know something is going on along this border, and they're not being told the truth, seldom even part of the truth. The people in the border states are becoming restless and frightened. I want to make sure you hear the rest of this and you comprehend what he's saying here. I've traveled in over 18 states this year, and my job is a lecturer. And I can tell you that the threat of internal violence from our own people, American citizens, is greater now than at any time since the Revolutionary War. Millions of Americans are becoming angered by the arbitrary manner in which their safety is being ignored by men they put into office. I have a great deal of faith in you, Trent. It's talking about Trent Lott, a congressman. I know you were among the 36 congressmen that warned President Reagan about the communist buildup in Mexico in 1982, under the leadership of my good friend, and this is now deceased, Congressman Larry McDonald. Remember, he was shot down in the 007 Korea jetliner by the Soviet Union. John Ashbrook of Ohio and Philip Crane of Illinois. I know you know of the situation. What's being done about it? And I'll skip just a little bit in here in order to save time. But he went on to show that there was more publicity placed when there was violence in Washington State last year by a small group called the Order. They were right-wingers, and they were beginning to store ammunition for the imminent overthrow of our government by the communists. And he said there was more publicity given to them than there ever has been in the collective 50-some-odd years since the communists moved into Mexico in our media. And he went on to show that in southern Missouri, most of us remember, south of Springfield, was also another group called the CSA. And they also actually killed one of their members. The state patrol killed one of their members and put him in prison. Or maybe they just captured him. He's the one that killed a state patrolman. Maybe that's the way it went. But anyway, he went on to show that the FBI right now acknowledges that there is 100,000 communist agents in the United States. And yet we're never told about that. And our government says, or the FBI says, well, our laws won't let us move in and arrest any of these people until they are actually in the act of overthrowing the government. And yet what did the FBI do with these right-wing groups that were not overthrowing the government in southern Missouri and in Washington State? They went in on sting operations. They shut them down. That's what it amounted to. Brethren, I think this is very important that we understand this, because the border situation is very difficult right now. There are millions of illegal aliens pouring into the southwestern part of the United States. All of these people speak Spanish. Do you realize already that the courts of this land have told us that we must provide bilingual education to them? That automatically doubles the cost of education at the taxpayer's expense. This means you have an English teacher or someone who speaks English teaching one group of students and someone who speaks Spanish teaching in the same classroom, teaching Spanish students. And so it doubles the cost of education. And who pays for it? You and me, the taxpayers. Not the illegal aliens who have no jobs, who pay no income tax. It's us. We're the one doing it. Now, as a direct result of all of this, I want to hold up the House of Representatives Joint Resolution. It's House Bill number 96, where they're trying to actually make a constitutional amendment stating that English is the national language and it cannot be another language. But those coming into this country must learn to speak English and be absorbed into our culture today. And there is a committee that's working on this right now, because in every court case so far in the United States, the Spanish illegal aliens have won every time. And if something isn't done, it's a historical fact. You can go back in history how various nations were overthrown and they lost their freedom. Every single time foreigners come in and speak a different language, it divides the country. No longer is it one nation and they all work with the same purpose, same goals, but it divides the country. And you have two separate cultures speaking two separate languages, not loyal to each other. And as a direct result, the overthrow of governments becomes easier. Now, the United States of America spends over $300 billion a year on its national defense budget. This is primarily to defend America and its allies against the fearsome threat that we know of as the Red Horse of the Apocalypse, or the Soviet Union, and all of its satellite states in Central Europe, and now all of Asia, and in the middle of Africa. They have just cut Africa up into thirds, and the whole middle strip of Africa is now communist. And then they're working outward toward the northern and southern borders. They're doing the same thing with Nicaragua down in Central America. Now, we have to spend such huge sums of taxpayers' money, that's our own money, in order to protect our national security and to help promote world peace, when at the same time we're spending hundreds of billions of our own tax money on defense. There are top American businessmen doing business with the Soviet Union. They're actually financing the Red Armies to go out into the world and take over every nation on earth. Also, we have banks who are lending money to the Soviet Union and her satellite states at 4% interest or less, and in some cases 0 interest for 15 years. You try to go to the bank and get a loan. Find out what your interest rate will be. It'll be minimum 2 to 3 times what the Soviet Union is receiving, and it'll start on the first day you get the money. You'll not have 15 years before the interest starts. Every single time. Also, these large corporations are transferring United States technology to the USSR. In turn, the USSR spends all of this money that's received in the promotion of this technology in order to build a Red Army to go out into the world, take peace from the earth, and to overthrow governments. So it actually makes no sense whatsoever, does it? Why would we want to spend money and give money to our enemy that's going to bury us? They've already stated that. Nikita Khrushchev stated it when he came to the United States. And he said on public television, "We will bury you." That was less than 30 years ago when he came. And yet, nothing has changed. It makes no sense whatsoever for us to build a military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union, who is our enemy. But some of America's leading businessmen will sell anything to anybody for a profit. They'll even sell the rope to hang themselves if there's a profit. But you see, the thing is, these men also meet behind boards, and they have planned a world government. So they're not as dumb as it seems. They're not just doing this arbitrarily just for money. They're doing it so they can control the entire world. Now, those who are involved in all of this, some of them are the United States Better Business Bureau, and the very president of it is a permanent member on a company called the USSR Trade and Economic Council. The head, this is the head now of the United States Better Business Bureau. He is actually a permanent member on this, we'll call it TEC, Trade and Economic Council. Now I want to go into this just for a minute because it's important we understand who is behind this military buildup. The key organization, according to this newsletter that I have before me, of Mr. Gary Allen report of October 1986. Here's what he says. The key organization now promoting more trade with the East Bloc is a high-level group which was founded during the Nixon administration and which has been revived in the 1980s. It's called the United States USSR Trade and Economic Council. Dr. Anthony Sutton, which I've quoted before, kept the books. He was an insider for these working for world government for 20 years. He saw the books. He saw their intention, but they kept everything secret. He puts out what's called a Phoenix newsletter. The January 1986 letter stated this, I quote, "A secret U.S.-Soviet operating group based in New York is acting in a manner strongly suggesting treason by its American members. And we do not use the word treason lightly." End of quote. He's talking about this Trade Economic Council. And it's important that we realize that this isn't just a group of fugitives that are running around the country trying to smuggle goods to the Soviet Union. Oh no. These aren't individuals trying to evade the FBI or the CIA. To be exact, these individuals control the FBI and the CIA. These people are the elite in the industrial field in the United States. They're bureaucrats working within the government. Here's what Dr. Sutton writes, quote, "This Trade Economic Council group has official sanction and backing. It links to Bush, Vice President Bush, elements in the White House, the National Association of Manufacturers, the United States Chamber of Commerce, and assorted senators and congressmen with more political ambition than common sense." End of quote. The Trade Economic Council has about 300 members presently, including such people as David Rockefeller, David Kendall of PepsiCo, William C. Norris of Control Data Corporation, Armand Hammer of Occidental Petroleum. Armand Hammer for years has been welcome in the Soviet Union. He flies his own private jet and lands in Moscow. These are people who are actually controlling economics in the United States. Now, membership in the Trade and Economic Council is secret, top secret. But Anthony Sutton, who worked inside with these people for 20 years before he decided to come out, and he wrote all of his books, he's obtained a partial listing of companies that are trading with the USSR. Here's some of them. Abbott Laboratories, Allen Bradley, Alice Chalmers, American Cyanamide, American Express, Armco Steel, Cargill, Caterpillar, Chase Manhattan Bank, Chemical Bank, Coca-Cola, ConAgra, Continental Grain, Corning Glass, Deere and Company, so John Deere, your tractor equipment, Dow Chemical, Dresser, Dresser Industries, DuPont, Gleason Corporation, Ingersoll Rand, International Harvester, Kodak, Marine Midland, Minnesota Mining, 3M, Monsanto, World Headquarters, St. Louis, Missouri, Occidental Petroleum, I mentioned that one, Stauffer Chemical, Union Carbide, remember the big plant that blew up in India that killed so many people, and Xerox Corporation. These are just some of them that he listed. He has others, but he didn't go ahead and give the names. But the USSR Trade and Economic Council is so secret that they won't even release the membership list either in public to the public or to the news media. They won't let anyone have it. To be exact, here's what Dr. Sutton says, quote, "Trade Economic Council will not even release its list to the United States firms unless the firm has passed an interview by a Soviet national whom we suspect has KGB links." End of quote. This list of companies that are trading with the Soviet Union is so secret that no one on that list knows who all the rest are, unless it's approved to make that knowledge known by a communist first. Has there been a sellout in the United States? Are we going down the drain? Is it true? I believe it is. I'm convinced that the United States is in trouble, and that our country, unless we repent as a whole, does not stand a chance of surviving the 1980s or early 1990s. There are 30 Soviet directors on this TEC Council, 20 American directors. Think about that. 60% is made up of communists. And of course the KGB and the Soviet government know who all these members are. And the State Department says they know. I wonder, since the State Department is for the enemy, well, maybe they would. Now, we know that the permanent directors of the Trade and Economic Council are Alexandra Trowbridge, Trowbridge. Now, he just happens to be the president of the National Association of Manufacturers. So here the top man and the president of the manufacturing corporations in this country is a permanent member of this council. And also Richard Lesher, Lesher, who is president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Now, I don't think these people just meet with the Soviet Union to have lunch. I believe they're there for one purpose, in order to trade and give our technology to the enemy. Now, Dr. Sutton wrote in his January newsletter, I quote, "The Trade Economic Council has 8 full-time Soviet engineers living in New York City to assess United States technology. The cost is paid for by the Trade and Economic Council members." So here are the corporations in the United States pays all of the rent on apartments, all their food, their total expense of 8 communists to live in New York and go over the technology that they're manufacturing and see which items they want to purchase for the Soviet Union. I'll continue his quote. "These Soviet engineers interview U.S. businessmen and assess the United States technology offered. They select technology required for Soviet military and facilitate the transfer." Isn't that incredible? What does the Constitution of the United States say? It says anyone is a traitor and it's treason if they aid and abet the enemy. When you provide an open book of all your technology and you take people, the enemy, into your manufacturing plants and show them how it all operates, then they decide whether to purchase that or not. And when they do purchase it, doesn't that make that company a traitor because they're aiding and abetting the enemy that's already said they're going to bury us? Oh yes. I've got a couple of ads, and they're on Xerox here, so they don't show up very good. But one of them is by Dresser Company, and it says, "Dresser, working with Soviet industry for 2 decades." Here's companies, United States corporations, and they put this ad in the Trade and Economic Council's journal, which now the Trade and Economic Council even denies that this journal exists, and yet they printed it for 10 straight years. And right here's an ad that appeared in it. Here's another one that appeared in it. Or this is the front cover. Journal of the United States USSR Trade and Economic Council, Volume 10, Number 2, 1985. And what is here? Here's an American flag and a Soviet flag on the same platform, and they're standing right next to each other on the front of the journal. It just goes to show we have been sold out. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever the United States has been sold out by big business, and they're allowing them to take over. Here's another ad by Gleason. It says, "Gleason is in gear with Soviet manufacturing." The Gleason Company, a manufacturer, and they're producing all types of tractor tires and various accoutrements and selling them to the Soviet Union. Treason is never mentioned. Never mentioned. Well, I think it's obvious that this information needs to be gotten out to the American people. Because there is high treason in various places in the government of the United States, the State Department, all the way up into the presidency of the United States. Remember a previous sermon that I gave where the Ford Foundation stated, the president of it stated that he was receiving directives from the White House to so alter the lifestyles and the communities of America to comfortably merge it for a world government with the Soviet Union. So there is treason. I want to give you a little scenario now. This is fictitious, but I want to ask you when I finish, could this be true and we just haven't been told yet? This is fictitious. Let's say there's a summit meeting in Washington, D.C., and it was heralded as a great step forward in the peace process. And the two most powerful leaders in the world are meeting in an atmosphere that the media would call friendly and cordial. And behind the scenes, though, a very different drama is being played and it's being worked out. President Ronald Reagan, he sat in an upright position behind closed doors, and he scanned over a document that was handed to him by Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. And this document outlined briefly the results of official and successful Soviet tests of their newly deployed anti-ballistic missile system. Remember, this was bought from United States technology, United States companies. In 50 tests, all 50 missile warheads were completely destroyed before reaching their targets in the USSR. So here now the Soviet Union, while President Reagan has talked about the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars program, nothing has ever happened on it. And yet the Soviet Union has been carrying out their own program for 15 years, preparing to destroy every one of our anti-ballistic missiles before they could reach one target in the Soviet Union. That's for real. Now let's continue. The president thought for a minute about this information that was handed to him by Gorbachev. And he thought within his mind, this confirms our intelligence reports. Yes, they do have a defensive system. Gorbachev just sat there. Remember, this is all make-believe right now. But when I'm through, I'm going to ask, could it be true? Could it have already happened? We just haven't been told yet. Gorbachev sitting there with a container that contained videotapes, computer tapes, which carried all the evidence necessary for a successful Soviet ABM test. He was waiting for President Reagan to get to the bottom line, which stated, will you submit to the Soviet Union? Well, finally, the moment came when President Reagan got to the bottom line. He used a curse word because what else could he think of at the moment? The message in the document was simple. It demanded the gradual, secret surrender of the United States in all foreign policy matters to the Soviet Union. Under their direction, the alternative was clear. A surgical first strike by the Soviet missiles against every United States strategic missile and bomber site, wiping out at least 95% of them within 25 minutes, and within 5 minutes after our radar picked them up. This is reality. That's why I'm making this fictionalized story. The tattered remnants of the United States missiles would then be easily stopped by the Soviet Union's own anti-ballistic missile system, which would be equivalent to our proposed Strategic Defense Initiative by President Reagan. After all of our missiles were destroyed, then the Soviet Union would have the choice. Either we would continue and surrender and be merged into a world government, or they would choose the 5 largest United States cities, including Washington, D.C., where bomb shelters have been built for the top 400 government officials, and they would be destroyed. As President Reagan sat there reading this information and discussing it with Gorbachev, of course, what could he say? The Soviet Union has already had built for them this mighty red horse of the apocalypse. They've gobbled up the most of the world already, and now they're aiming their missiles at us. They already have a strategic defense against ballistic missiles. Gorbachev, in our story, calmly said, because the lights flickered in the White House, only momentarily, and then suddenly they came back on, quote, "That would be the electromagnetic pulse." Because you see, in the country of Bulgaria, there was a museum where Tesla's electronic, all his devices were on display. All of his programs and all of his discoveries were there. And when the Soviet Union took over Bulgaria, they confiscated all of Tesla's experiments with extremely low frequency electromagnetic waves. They're called ELFs. And so what it amounts to is that the Soviet Union was going to show Ronald Reagan that they meant business. And so here's what Gorbachev said. That would be the electromagnetic pulse efforts from the 4 nuclear warheads we had in orbit. The electromagnetic pulse, he said, has now knocked out at least half of all United States communications and electronic devices. I see your White House emergency generator comes online very quickly. Well, the president sat there numbed because he now realized that the American people had not been told in the past. We had no defense against the Soviet Union. Sweat began to break out all over him. Gorbachev continued telling of his demands. It won't be all bad, of course. This arrangement won't even cost you votes. It will all be accomplished under our direction in the name of peace and the lessening of tensions. Here's what we want, Gorbachev said. First, the Star Wars development must be stopped. Star Wars, a strategic defense initiative by President Reagan, should never be deployed. There would be no defense against ballistic missiles in the United States. They said you can continue to research and develop them, but never deploy them for your defense. Some of the technology you discover will be helpful to our systems that we already have in effect. So your scientists will transfer that technology in your research and to us. He went on to say, we also want all actions against our friends in Nicaragua stopped. You shall also stop all aid to reactionary forces around the world from Angola to Afghanistan. Now, if this were to happen, would the red horse of the apocalypse gobble up the rest of the world with no interference whatsoever? Oh, yes. If we were told in secret, we'll blow you off the map, or you take our directive so we can gradually take over the world, our government at this point would have no choice. No choice. Do you realize that back in the 1950s we used to have civil defense centers? We would go into schools and they were prepared where there were fallout shelters all over the country. You very seldom find one anymore, do you? When's the last time you've noticed one, civil defense, fallout shelter, anywhere in a large building, a school, church? It doesn't matter. Because all of our military has been destroyed by the McNamara, his era, in the government of the United States. He went on to say, finally, you shall join with us, the Soviet Union, in correcting the situation in South Africa by helping our friends in the African National Congress, which are communists. Therefore, they would overthrow the South African government for communism. Of course, if they did this, this means all the strategic materials and minerals and so on that goes into our defense system would no longer be available to us because it would be under the control of international communism. Therefore, we could not go on and make our submarines that go down and they have to be pressurized with certain minerals. We couldn't go out into outer space because of certain minerals that only come from South Africa. And so we would become a second and a third-rate nation in comparison to the Soviet Union, who would now control all of these elements. And then Gorbachev, in our unreal, pretend circumstances, says, my last condition, This agreement between our two governments must be kept in the strictest of secrecy. We don't want any trouble from your citizens. What did Colonel Jack Moore say in his letter that I started off this message with? He said that he's toured 18 states, most of them in the southwestern part of the United States, and that people are restless and are more up in arms because of the lack of defense of our border and illegal aliens pouring across than they have ever been since the Revolutionary War. This means if these things were to be carried out, and the Soviet Union now is dictating to us our policy, then more and more people are going to become disillusioned. And we're going to begin to see violence in the streets of America. American citizen against American citizen. Anyone who will not join with us, the patriots, to fight against the commies, then we will be automatically placed on the same list with them. You see what they're doing? They're dividing the country. They want to call out those who are for America, and they want to stamp them out, and this is exactly what's going to take place. Gorbachev went ahead in our fictional story. He said any leakage of this agreement through your newspapers, the press, the news media, will be considered an abrogation of the document, and we will attack immediately. If they were to attack immediately, our radar picks up missiles coming across the North Pole only 5 minutes from target. There would be no way we could dispatch any anti-ballistic missiles to stop them. We're totally defenseless. The United States has been unilaterally disarmed by our own State Department. Reagan, according to this scenario, would sit back in his chair without a word to say, in total shock, because he didn't realize what he had been working for all these years. As I gave in the sermon, Will the Real Ronald Reagan Stand Up? And I gave all of his background showing that he had a socialist background, and all he has ever done is pass socialist programs. And yet, here he is coming face to face with reality. The time they've been working for, total subjugation of our government. Brethren, this scenario has only been fictional. It is not real. But it makes me wonder whether it could be real or not, because of the directives of our own State Department in solving international problems. The United States of America has not won any war since World War II. Not one. That tells me, before World War II, we had a program where we trained our military. We trained them how to fight wars, how to win wars, how to use weapons. But then, since World War II, there has been a whole series of individuals who has now come into our armed forces, and they no longer teach us how to win wars, but how to have a defense department. How only to defend ourselves against aggression, not go out and be the aggressors to win. No longer. The Air Force has revealed that long-range Soviet Bear bombers have been flying simulated attack flights across Alaska and the border of Alaska within 40 miles of its coast for some years now. The United States F-15s have made repeated interception of these bombers. And they describe them that they are updated versions of the Tu-95 that they're using over in the Philippines or not the Philippines, but in Vietnam, Saigon. And they've adopted the Carrier nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and they're now floating off the coast of the United States. Now, intelligence resources report that Moscow has sharply increased their overt and covert military aid to virtually every other state that the Soviet Union controls. They're now pouring millions of tons of military equipment into Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Syria, Vietnam, Nicaragua, Cuba, and they're building up their forces all over the world now, while the United States is depleting its resources. from Europe. Jane's Defense Weekly, JANE''S, stated this. This is a reliable British publication. It reports that the Ayatollah Khomeini has given the Soviets access to our CIA-built monitoring stations in northern Iran. We built them. The CIA was involved, and now that Khomeini has taken over and it's a socialist country, the Soviets are now using it. And they're using it against NATO facilities in the northern or eastern Mediterranean. Jane's report also said that a new Soviet fighter plane, the Su-27, has now been deployed. And it's narrowing the technology gap in military aircraft between the Soviet Union and the United States. And in the same report, she said, the Institute of Strategic Studies in London stated the Soviets have increased their stockpile of long-range nuclear warheads by 37% in the last 3 years, while we haven't done anything. So much for the November's Geneva Summit Conference of last year. The Soviet Union continues to build. Does anyone know what the word unilateral means? Uni is one, isn't it? Here we see all the time in the American media, there's a unilateral disarmament. That means one country is disarming while the other one is building. The United States is the one who has agreed to unilaterally disarm. That's us. How long will it be until this new world government takes over? Revelation 13 says it's going to rise out of the sea of humanity. It's going to come out of every nation on earth at the identical same time and rear its ugly head, and it will be world government. And they're taking over now within the United States. According to a Pentagon report that came out, the Soviet Union now has 10 medium-range bombers at Vietnam's Cam Ranh Bay, along with a number of naval strike aircraft. Now, all of these are within easy distance of 3 of the world's most vulnerable choke points. These are very vital to us. They are the Straits of Malacca near Singapore, the Straits of Sunda and Makassar near Indonesia. There goes, if they control all of these straits, there goes some of our shipping lanes in that area of the world. Soviet naval and air buildups also have been underway within striking distance of other vital passageways in the oceans. Newly built Nicaraguan air bases, and they are built long enough so that they can allow jet fighters to land there, together with the Soviet Union's building up of the Cuban airfields, pose a real threat to the Panama Canal and the Straits of Florida. Now, you think about it. We've already turned over the Panama Canal to a Marxist regime. And so eventually we will not even have use of it. And if Nicaragua and Cuba decides that they'll go in and take over Panama, our forces in the Pacific Ocean will not be able to come through the Panama Canal and come to the east coast of the United States. They would have to go all the way around South America, weeks longer than normal. These things are reality, but our news media never tell us these things. Is the red horse of the apocalypse gaining momentum in the world? Is it gaining momentum within the United States of America? And there is a philosophy right now in Washington, D.C. The philosophy is better red than dead. This is why our country and our own government and our elected officials will do nothing to stop the menace of international socialism. Well, there's a man who was in prisons for many, many years in the Soviet Union. He's now escaped and he's come into the United States of America. He has documented proof that the Soviet Union is using psychiatry and psychiatric hospitals to put those individuals who are against their takeover of governments. And now we see today that the last 50 individuals who have gone before the Congress of the United States, in a regress of grievances, are either in prison or psychiatric hospitals in the United States, not the Soviet Union. 50 out of 50. 100% of those who go and regress grievances before the Congress, which our Constitution gives us the right, have been imprisoned or in psychiatric wards today. This is dangerous business. They plan on having world government and you and I as their subjects. Well, I want to just give one little point that he mentions before I go on. He says, look, you people in America don't realize that the Soviet Union has no intention of ever keeping one agreement they make. They state that agreements are like pie crust to be broken. V.I. Lenin said that. That was the original policy of the Soviet Union. We'll make treaties with the United States, but we'll break them. But they will keep them. Haven't we? Sure we have. We keep them and they break them. That's why they've taken over militarily. Superiority to the United States. Now, we have weapons, but it doesn't do any good if we have weapons that are superior to them if the officials who can give the word to use them won't do it. See? This is the problem. And then in turn, we give them our technology, and then they develop the superiority. But here's what he says. He talks about Americans being do-gooders today. He said the Soviet Union has infiltrated every strata of society, and they've tried to make Americans feel guilty because of the repressed people of the world. They've tried to make us become do-gooders, always trying to make peace and be friendly, which is a very bad tactic, he says, I'm quoting his words, for dealing with the Soviet Union. And because of this attitude, Americans subconsciously suppress the notion of threat of the Soviet Union. Don't we see people living today and having their fun as if it's the last moment of their life? Every Friday and Saturday night, when work is over, all they do is head out to where they can have fun, party, play, the pleasures of the flesh, because they don't think they're going to have another week to do it. So they've got to have fun while the fun is here. Yes, people know something is wrong. They know it. And he says it. He says they're going through the same sequence as someone who has just been informed that he or she has a terminal cancer. According to medical psychology, such a patient first passes through several stages. Compare this and see if this isn't the American people today. First, rejection. No, it didn't happen to me. I don't have cancer. And what do we say? Oh no, the Soviet Union isn't going to take over our country. It could never happen here. That's what everybody says when I talk to them. Second, they feel guilt. I've done something wrong. They always think. This is what he says. Psychiatrists will tell you that a cancer patient always says, well, I've done something wrong, so I'm being punished through cancer. That's exactly the way we feel. We've done something wrong, but that's true. We have. We've turned our back upon our God. And then the third stage, he says, is realization. He says there must be a better explanation, followed by a totally false explanation. They don't want to face reality. They'd rather believe a lie than the truth. And so here it is, pouring across our borders are millions of illegal aliens. The FBI says they know of 100,000 Soviet agents in this country. The White House and the State Department for years has turned country after country over to the communists. We haven't won a war, and yet we blind our eyes and say, oh no, there's got to be another reason. We won't listen to reality. And then fourth, depression sets in. It's hopeless. Isn't that what's happening in America today? They keep seeing the Soviet Union gobble country after country after country, and we're in retreat. So we've just gone in depression and say, well, if they're going to take over, so we've got to have our fun now before they do. Then it's all over. This is what's happening in America. And brethren, it is not going to be fun for those of us who are Christians as well as those who are not. Now, I want to start bringing this to a close with my final little section today. I've talked about a fictional scenario. What if those politicians have already sold out America, though? I'm just saying, what if? I want to read word for word an article by Brigadier General Andrew Gatsis, Gatsis, United States of America, retired. This is his words. This is not made up. United States foreign policy clearly enshrines the abandonment of anti-communist countries friendly to the United States. Our policy now is to abandon every country friendly to us and turn them over to communism. He says it ostensibly on the grounds that they are repressive right-wing dictatorships. I'll continue his letter. Such terms were used against Batista of Cuba. Remember that? How the present dictator was hailed as, a freedom fighter going to give the people of Cuba freedom from that dictatorship under Batista. And what do we have? Communism. Chiang Kai-shek of China. And who was replaced, or who was he replaced by? The butcher, Mao Zedong. 66 million slaughtered. And then 2 of South Vietnam was overthrown. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. Somoza of Nicaragua. Marcos of the Philippines. Ian Smith of Rhodesia. Every one of them replaced by a communist regime. And it took 6 to 8 months before finally Castro admitted he was communist. How long is it going to take for the Philippines before they finally admit it? Continue his letter. The few loyal allies that America has left, such as South Africa, South Korea, and Taiwan, are also being abandoned. The big mistake made by these unfortunate victims of United States treachery was that they trusted us. In the early 1970s, when I, and this is Brigadier General Andrew Gatsis, as a senior military officer visited the Taiwanese government in an official capacity, senior Chinese officials refused to believe me when I advised them that the United States government was planning to abandon Taiwan and recognize Red China. They wouldn't believe it because America was their ally. And yet this man was the one who officially broke the news to them. Is it reality today? Who sits in the United Nations organization as the official representative of the Chinese people? It used to be Formosa or Taiwan, Nationalist China. Today it's Red China, and Taiwan was kicked out and can't even send a representative. I'll continue his article. They remained unconvinced even when they were told that I had been designated as the plan's officer to draw up the schedule for pulling United States Army troops out of their country. In spite of their disbelief that the United States would do anything so dastardly, United States troop redeployment out of Taiwan was effected a year later. The average United States citizen refuses to believe, get this, that the Soviet government is only a peripheral enemy and that the real threat comes from a Western power structure made up of governmental officials and their non-governmental confederates who secretly espouse the same objectives as openly avowed communists. We cannot believe in this country that our own people use the free enterprise system to become wealthy could espouse communism and be the founders and the supporters of communism. And if we were to cut off our technology and our grain sales to them, they would collapse. I'll continue his letter. These underhanded activists, whom we shall call the insiders, promote one world government through a gradual transition from freedom to international socialism. See, it's gradual. You don't know what's happening to you. It's so subtle. Among their hidden agenda items are desires to destroy American nationalism. Is it popular today to go out to a ball game, put your hand over your heart and sing our national anthem? No, it's not popular. No sports activity in high schools. The kids are now pressured by peer pressure not to sing the national anthem. Here's what he went on to say. Their hidden agenda was to neutralize United States intelligence agencies, such as the FBI and CIA. Hasn't that happened? The FBI had to destroy 14,000 files on communists. They only have 55 left. Is it happening? Promote a sense of guilt and shame among Americans. Convince Americans that all allies who oppose socialism are violators of human rights and should be toppled in the name of democracy and weaken the United States national defenses. It's happening everywhere in the world. And this man was a part of the military apparatus until he found out that our government is now socialist. And then he came out of it to fight them. Listen to what he says now, and I'll bring this to a close. In the late 1940s, the stage was set to begin brainwashing American military officers to think liberal and to promote international socialism. The war colleges that produced future generals began to reorient thinking of professional military men from fighting to intellectualism. The instruction focused increasingly on compromise, appeasement. You don't go and win the victory, you compromise. And the downgrading of United States national interest to a position of secondary importance in relation to world affairs. This was introduced before World War II was even over and the ashes had settled. Our whole military operations has now gone from winning and victory to appeasement and giving away other countries rather than having to fight. I'll continue his article. As a student in the Air War College in 1963 and 1964, I personally experienced the transformation of the curriculum. I estimate that 90% of the guest lecturers were extremely liberal and embraced the principles of world government. Some of the main speakers were Henry Kissinger, and I've quoted his articles out of the Fort Lauderdale Times from the 1970s that said they hoped to have a loosely knit world government by the end of the 1970s. Henry Kissinger, and he's the one that went to the Shah of Iran. And after he went to see the Shah, was the Shah overthrown? Oh, yes, he was. He was the hatchet man. Also, other guest lecturers, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Anybody ever heard of him? He wrote the book Between the Two Ages, The Technological Age, and in those books he said over and over and over, Marxism is the wave of the future, the United States Constitution is obsolete, and that we had better be prepared for world government with the Soviet Union. And yet he's a lecturer at our Air Force bases to train the future generals. Another one was Averell Harriman, long-time communist, and now he's died. He was from California. Norman Cousins was another one, long-time communist. George Ball in the present State Department, and he was a CFR member. Dean Rusk, Elspeth Rostow, then Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, longtime socialist, and rendered decisions against freedom for the United States. And some of these still remain on the scene. All of these that I mentioned, except Averell Harriman, died in August of 1986. I'll continue his article now. The rare conservatives, perhaps 10 among the hundreds of speakers, could hardly have been left off the program, for they were mainly high-ranking military men like General Curtis LeMay, who was Chief of the Air Force at that time. After all, some military philosophy had to be worked into a college designed to train future generals to fight and win wars. So they had to allow some lecturing by military people, but most of them were these people promoting world government and how to appease the enemy and give in to them rather than defeat them. Continuing his article, I still remember Dr. Brzezinski's lecture on the subject of world communism. His main theme was the transformation of the role of the United States from independence to interdependence. No longer an independent sovereign nation, but we would be intertwined and interdependent with the Soviet Union through trade agreements. And therefore, it would be no difference between us and them. It would be world government. I was completely shocked when he told us that as military officers, we should first redefine what it means to win. Redefine victory. When I complained to the authorities of the college about the extremely unbalanced liberal curriculum and requested more conservative instruction and guest speakers, I was told that I was out of date. Earlier in the school year, I asked Averell Harriman, then a roving ambassador for the Kennedy administration, to tell the students why our government was undermining President Diem, the president of South Vietnam. Harriman went into a rage, told me to sit down, and denied that the United States government was working against Diem. Needless to say, I was thoroughly reprimanded by the senior Army faculty member for confronting Ambassador Harriman. A short time later, Diem was assassinated. This tells you things, doesn't it? This man was high up in the military for the United States. He actually delivered messages to governments telling them that they were no longer friends of the United States, and we had accepted communism instead of them. I'll continue. One example of brainwashing through the academic department occurred in November of 1981 when Reverend William Sloan Coffin, Jr. lectured cadets at the United States Military Academy. You have to understand, this man is a socialist. He uses the name Reverend, but he's a socialist. He is a pacifist. He is against us standing up against communism anywhere. His themes were, and these are some of the themes that he discussed: nuclear situational ethics, strategic nuclear pacifism, American unilateral disarmament. America will disarm and let Russia continue to build. And of course, he says these were surprising subjects at the primary training school for America's future professional soldiers. The main objective of the hidden agenda for United States defense is to make the American citizenry become aware of defeat. They're now programming us to defeat. This theme is advanced by a propaganda drive through the major news media that victory is not worth the price. Brethren, victory is worth it, especially in Christ Jesus. We realize we're not going to save America. Wholesale repentance is all that'll save America. But you and I must continue in Christ. The victory is in Christ. We will then solve the world's problems. We can't do it today. I want to continue this and then end it for today. But I do want you to hear every word of his letter. He says it parallels the communist language that peace requires the prior destruction of the very idea of military victory. So they say when the Soviet Union says peace, there can be no peace in the world until everyone becomes communist. That's called newspeak. It's opposite. They use the word peace when they mean war until we've achieved peace through world government. See? So you can't believe one thing a communist ever says because they double talk you. They've got their own vocabulary. To win a war, the objective must be to destroy the enemy or to break his will to resist. After World War II, the United States Armed Forces were compelled to abandon this doctrine. They were suppressed, or they were pressed to replace deep objectives with shallow ones which always allowed the enemy to escape. Vietnam, they would go along and we had to give our battle plans to a communist 24 hours before we could go through with the program. He would in turn give it to the North Vietnamese. They would move their military personnel. We would go over and bomb rice paddies, where just the day before a whole battalion of Vietnamese would be. And so there was no way to win. We allowed the enemy to escape because of the United Nations and our treaty with it as peacekeeping operations. And always a communist. This is by agreement with Stennis, who made the agreement at the Big Five conference when the United Nations started. They said always a communist would head up the military apparatus of the United Nations. Since then, United States units have suffered a series of military failures. The Korean War, Vietnam, Cambodia. It is notable that America never lost a war so long as we had a Department of War, and never has won one since it became the Department of Defense. We taught our people how to wage war at one time, but now they're only teaching them how to appease and avoid war. It's called defense. Oh, let's defend ourselves by giving up. More than just the name of the department was changed. There was a fundamental change in philosophy as well. And I'll get into that at another time. New Agers have infiltrated the whole military apparatus. In Vietnam, we were forced by our own government to violate all standard military doctrine and to fight the war in the most inefficient and costly way possible. Forced into it by our own government. The net result of this ludicrous concept of operations was an attrition rate that produced a defeatist attitude among Americans. They would allow the American boys to go up and just be killed by the hundreds and thousands so that our army would develop a defeatist attitude saying we can't win. When we had the bombs and the nuclear weapons, we could have bombed Hanoi, we could have had the war over with within 48 hours, and that's a statistical fact. But they had to create defeatism in the American people. So we came home with our tails between our legs and our heads bowed low, and we've never won a war since then. And created the perfect climate for the abandonment of our allies to the communists under the famous slogan, peace with honor. We could not bomb within a restricted radius of Hanoi, even though the enemy anti-aircraft defenses located in that area were shooting our planes down every day. Plans to bomb and break the dikes in North Vietnam, flooding the rice paddies, and destroying the food supplies were ruled out as too barbaric. War is barbaric no matter what it is. I'll continue, and I'm just about through. We hear much rhetoric today from President Reagan on the need for a strong defense. From documented experience, here is a brigadier general, retired from the military. He's got the inside dope. Here's what he said. From documented experience, I have drawn from the reader a real mental picture or the threat to America's combat potential. An objective thinker will conclude that President Reagan is a master at saying what he knows the average American citizen wants to hear about defense, while allowing actions that promote the hidden agenda, an agenda that erodes the ability of America's armed forces to fight. Reagan talks about the Strategic Defense Initiative to keep the Soviet Union from attacking America, and yet his real aims undercover are to destroy the military so they can take over. And I refer you back to all the documentation I gave in the sermon, Will the Real Ronald Reagan Stand Up?, to prove that he is a socialist and he's going by their blueprint to destroy America. Concluding paragraph. Around 500 BC, Sun Tzu, a great Chinese author and general, said in his book, The Art of War, quote, "Know the enemy and the battle is half won. Know yourself and the battle is yours." End of quote. One of the problems in America today is that we neither understand international socialism, we don't understand the red horse of the apocalypse, we don't understand the white horse of the apocalypse, we don't understand their objectives, we don't understand the revolutionary catechism, which tells how to infiltrate every strata of society and destroy it from within, but pretend to be a part of that society. And it's because we don't understand these things then we are not winning the war. We are losing. Now, let's get down to my concluding scriptures for today. In Ezekiel, once again, Ezekiel chapter 3. Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 4. And he said unto me, Son of man, go get you unto the house of Israel, and speak with my words unto them. For you're not sent to a people of a strange speech and of a hard language, but to the house of Israel. I do not presume to be the person that Ezekiel is talking about here today, but I will use the scripture to say that those here are radio programs are hearing it in their own language. They can't misunderstand what is being said. We are in danger of being taken over by the Soviet Union. Not to many people of a strange speech and a hard language, whose words you cannot understand. Surely, had I sent you to them, they would have hearkened unto you. If someone such as Jonah was sent to another nation, Nineveh, they would have repented. But when you send someone who speaks the same language, looks alike, talks alike, from the midst of the people, they are familiar with you. Just like when a minister comes up, God raises him up out of his own family, the family won't be a part of it, because they're familiar with him. They know all of his faults. And therefore, how could God use that person? They won't listen to him. It's the same way in the United States. People will not listen and change. Verse 7, but the house of Israel will not hearken unto you, for they'll not hearken unto me. For all the house of Israel, I'm going to correct the phrase here, are stiff of forehead and hard of heart. Hard-hearted. Behold, I've made your face strong against their faces, and your forehead strong against their forehead. As an adamant harder than flint have I made your forehead. Fear them not. Neither be dismayed at their looks, though they be a rebellious house. Brethren, we must stand if necessary, and if the day ever comes where we're taken off radio, if we eventually will go on television, and if they stop us from television because our message is so strong, you as an individual as well as I must be willing to confront people head on, face to face. And don't you flinch when you say it. God Almighty is calling this nation to repentance. If not, they will be destroyed. Verse 10, moreover, he said unto me, Son of man, all my words that I shall speak unto you receive in your heart, and hear with your ears, and go, get to them of the captivity, unto the children of your people, and speak unto them, and tell them, thus says the Lord God, whether they'll hear or whether they'll forbear. It does not matter whether they listen, whether we ever have another convert to Jesus Christ or not. It doesn't matter. We've got to give the message. That's our responsibility. We don't want the blood of their head on ours. Their blood must remain upon their own hands. Brethren, I pray that you and I will have a good understanding of what is about to take place so that we can avoid and escape those things that are about to come.